Part one of this review, it's a Harbor Freight 68887 90 amp Flux-Cored Wire feed welder. It's the latest in a series of welders that company has become pretty famous for. You'll see them advertised local newspapers, of course on the Harbor Freight websites. Usually the older models are blue and the newer model is black. It also denotes some other changes in the machines, but they generally pretty much are all going to work about the same way. They all feed off of regular 120 power. I mean single phase 120 outlet. But you have to realize that the 1 means single phase. The 20 amp means you really need to be feeding this off of a full power electrical socket, like something that would be used for a washing machine or a stove or a refrigerator. Something like a regular bedroom socket may not be able to push enough power for this thing to work effectively, but we'll get a little more into that later. The wire feed welder, which means that it uses a torch gun and then feeds wire through the machine out through here. And although the specifications are that can use 030 or 035 wire, my recommendation on this is pretty much only use the 030 wire. If you try to use the 035 wire, you're going to find yourself not necessarily being able to get full power out of this thing. It takes heat and energy to melt the metal and make the welds, and the thicker that wire is, the more it requires. Well, this is what's called Flux-Cored Wire. So even though it looks like other types of weld wire, you'll notice that on the inside here that it is it's kind of a silver color. Non-Flux-Cored wire is usually kind of a copper color, and it's actually all steel. It's just that the non-Flux-Cored stuff is copper coated to increase the its ability to push electricity through the from this mechanism all the way down to the gun. The Flux-Cored wire, this is actually, even though it looks like wire and it looks solid, it's actually a hollow tube. And in the core of that is a lot of the same basic material that you would see on the outside of a regular welding rod. So this feed mechanism, when the machine's turned on, feeds wire through here. There's a little drive wheel on this situation here. When you go to restring new wire on there, that's how that thing would feed through here to make that thing work. One of the things to look out for, of course, when you start running low on wire, if you totally run out the wire, it should have some tension, and then it stops here. It's not going to keep feeding all the way through to the gun. So you end up throwing a little bit of wire away every time you change it. Instructions on changing a wire are all pretty easy. It's right there on a label. Some improvements over older models is that this thing, even though it's plastic, and they've replaced a lot of metal parts with plastic parts, it is a little bit more robust than older models. A lot of time these little drive wheels are supposed to be replaceable on higher end welders. On these, by the time those drive wheels go bad, this whole thing's just throw away. And I'll get a little bit more into the price on that later. You've got a little bit of a tension adjustment, which usually where you're having to deal with the tension adjustment right here is when the weather is making this thing sweat, or for whatever reason it starts getting slippery and it's not feeding right. You've got a speed adjustment for how fast it spits the wire out right over here, this little dial here. You are unlikely to ever use this over the halfway setting. And the reason is that if you have it set for all the way in a speed, it's not going to run wire. You're not going to melt it at that rate. And all you're going to do is just push and waste wire. So it probably, you're operating this thing usually at around the 30% range to the 50% range. There is no other dial. Remember, this is about $100 to $150 welder. There is no dial for the temperature setting. There's merely a minimum and a maximum. If you have any doubts about the capability of the electrical circuit you're using, like it may be a 15 amp circuit, you'll want to use this on the minimum setting. If you know for certain that you have a 20 amp circuit, and the metal that you're welding is thicker than really thin sheet metal, then you can set it over to max. One of the better guides to use on whether or not the sheet metal is too thick or too thin to weld, this sheet metal that the machine is made out of, you should be able to weld with this on a minimum setting. If it's any thicker than the sheet metal that it's made out of, switch it over to the maximum setting. You've also got a guideline here for the wire feed speeds and everything, depending on the type of wire. I would call this a guideline. Okay, it's not carved in stone, but it gives you a good starting point when you get a little project going, and you want to have a starting point on where you set all your stuff. Then fine, work with it. The thing, what you'll find is that depending on the power source that you have and the thickness of the metal, a couple other variables, the weather, how good your ground is. This thing sometimes doesn't grab on quite right to get a good ground. Some people will modify this and replace it with one from a higher end welder because these parts are not very expensive. Then that may cause these settings to change, but they work as a good general guideline. So you've got instructions right there on how to change the wires here. I'm going to show that in another video. You've got some other safety guidelines and things right on the labeling. The machine has what's called a very short duty cycle, which means that there's a 20% duration of use at max setting, and then it's a little bit more if you're not. So let's say out of every 10 minutes you would be burning wire for 2 minutes. Out of every minute maybe you're burning wire for 10 seconds. You can't just burn wire continuously on this thing without it overheating. If it overheats and stops working, you'll see a little warning light here, and then the machine's got to be allowed to cool down. There is an onboard cooling fan to reduce the chances of that happening. But remember, this is not an all-day, everyday use type of machine. Basically emergency, hobby use, and if you're going to make money with a machine like this, realize it's not very expensive. You should be able to charge $20 an hour for your use of this machine. The machine only costs about $100 to $150. So assume that within a day or two of work, you've paid for your machine. And if you're doing relatively light-duty welding and in other tasks of that day involve the cutting metal and stacking metal and doing other things, the machine pays for itself very quickly. And so as a tool in the handyman toolbox, it definitely puts you in a little different league of being able to fix things. Just remember, this is for steel only and not for aluminum or stainless steel. For example, the bicycles you'll see in the background, there's almost nothing I would be able to weld on those with this machine. But a lot of motorcycles have components that are made out of steel, especially older motorcycles. So if you need to do some repair on an older motorcycle or scooter, or automotive welding repair, a single use of this machine is going to pay for itself compared to what it might cost you to go to a welding shop. In fact, what it costs you on average to go to a welding shop, you can afford to buy the machine. What you obviously are going to have another issue with is the skill at using it. They are a little bit tricky. It does take a touch, and I'm going to show some of that in some other videos. And they don't produce the highest quality welds. Even on your best day with a machine like this, because Flux-Cored Wire is not going to produce the best quality of welds, you may not be satisfied with the results. On the other hand, if you're mainly looking for structural project steel, you're building a trailer frame, building a roof rack for something, I think you should be just fine. Especially if you're doing things, let's say, to reinforce something that would otherwise only be bolted together and might vibrate loose. You're also going to find that if you're building projects out of metal, that joining metal with welding overall is cheaper than using bolts, nuts, and screws. It usually works out to be cheaper. It also saves weight. A lot of people talk about when something's welded together, you can't take it back apart to service it. Well, yes, you can. I find a lot of times it's faster to have something that's made out of metal that I can simply cut apart and then re-weld once I'm set up for the welding. It's faster to cut something apart and then re-weld it than it is to work with a bunch of bolts, nuts, and screws, depending on how secure I needed that piece to be. And bolts, nuts, and screws do eventually loosen up. Welded steel, kind of permanent unless you're cutting it apart, or it's a high-stress wear item. Do I recommend this machine for everybody all the time? No. But I would say that if you're not otherwise a welder and you're not necessarily wanting to have professional grade machines around, and it's more important to have a complete set of tools than it is to have the very best of something, definitely add one of these to your kit if you don't otherwise have a welder. Would I buy new or used? Generally speaking, I'm inclined to buy these new because they're such a good deal new. And they can have wear out issues to the point where if it doesn't look pretty darn new, getting one of these used is a real gamble. You can't get spare parts for them very easily, and the servicing on them usually long distance. Even if you have a local Harbor Freight store, their usual way of solving a problem on one of these is to ask for your receipt and then replace the unit. Would I purchase the extended warranty on one? Maybe, maybe not. It depends on how much I'm going to use it. My personal situation is I buy a new one about every year or two, and I don't bother saving the receipts. Occasionally I'll look on Craigslist, I'll try to find one used. This one I happen to buy new. The last one I bought used off of a guy who he used it exactly once for a small project. It paid for itself. He sold it to me for $60, and it lasted a little bit over a year. I can't go wrong with a purchase like that. This one, I hit the coupons right, paid $100. I'm not going to complain at all. And it's going to end up paying for itself on another project today. But in reality, it paid for itself within 2 days of me buying it. So that is the Harbor Freight 6887 Flux-Cored Wire Feed Welder. I'd say it's a 4 stars out of 5 piece of equipment. And you're going to see this in some other videos of mine.